Now the image here did not change despite the roll dice function being executed because we're in a stateless widget. And this is just one of two main ways of creating widgets, and it's the wrong approach for widgets that should have internally changing data. It is absolutely the kind of widget you should use if you just have a widget that takes some input values and then outputs some widgets. But if you have a widget that has some data that can change internally and where such data changes then should affect the rendered UI, as it's the case here, where the image we want to display on the screen in our own widget here depends on this active dice image variable, if we have a scenario like this, stateless widget is the wrong choice. We should instead create this as a stateful widget. So what's the difference? Stateful widgets, as the name implies, allow us to manage state inside of them. And state simply is data that may change over time and that should impact the rendered UI. So if the data changes, the user interface should change. We simply have different states of our user interface, you could say. So therefore here, indeed, the first step is to convert this to a stateful widget to make sure that in here the data may change. Though to be precise, it would be a bit overkill to change the entire gradient container to a stateful widget, since the majority of this widget actually does not depend on that changing data. It's really just this part here, this image, and the button. Only these things work together to change the image. The rest of the widget is pretty stable. Therefore here it would actually be preferable to break this widget up into two separate widgets. One stateless widget, this one, and one stateful widget which contains the image and the button. And that is what I'll do here to keep the overall code organized. For that I'll add a new file here, which I'll name dice_roller.dart. Because in there, I want to create a widget called dice roller, which will be that stateful widget we're about to create. Therefore, dice roller should extend stateful widget. And in order to do that, we here also must import package flutter and then material dart. So it's still the same import as before, but now we extend stateful widget here. Now this class here, dice roller, which extends stateful widget, now is defined in a different way than we did it before for the stateless widget. Here we don't add a build method. We do not do that if we have a stateful widget. Instead, in here, we must add a create state method. So a method called create state, but just as with build, we should add the add override annotation here. Because that's basically another method we're forced to implement because we're extending stateful widget here. Now create state does not take a value here, but it actually returns a value. It returns a state object. Now that's a type built into Flutter, provided by Flutter, and state, like list earlier, is a generic value type. Hence, we have to add these angle brackets to basically inform Dart which kind of state will be managed here. And here it should be the state for the dice roller class, for the dice roller widget. Therefore, the value passed between those angle brackets should be your class name, dice roller, in my case. And in the body of this create state method, you then have to return such a state value, so a value that has this type. And this value is created with yet another class. When using stateful widget, you will always work with two classes. This is the first class here, and then you must add a second class, which typically should start with an underscore, and I'll get back to that in a second, and then dice roller state. So the convention is to pick up your widget class name and append state at the end and start with that underscore, that leading underscore. This underscore has a special meaning in Dart. It means that this class will be private. It will only be usable in this file. Even if you import this file into another file, that other file will not be able to access this state class here. And the reason for that is that this state class is really only meant to be used internally by this dice roller widget class here. Now this state class here also must extend something, and that something is state again. So this state value, though here again we have to embrace the fact that this is a generic type and add the angle brackets, and here in between again we add our widget class name, dice roller. So we extend this state class adjusted for our widget class name here. And inside of this state class, we now have to add that good old build method again. So stateful widgets are in the end split across two classes, and the reason for that is simply that they're managed in a special way internally by Flutter. Flutter essentially requires these two classes to be detached from each other. Now the build method works just as the build method in the stateful widget though. You add override, you return a widget, so a value of type widget, you will get this context parameter, and then here you return your widget or widget combination, your widget tree. In my case here, that means that I want to return this column here. So I'll select this column, taking advantage of these nice annotations which are shown in my code editor here because of the Flutter extension that we installed, telling me where the column widget ends. And I cut this from gradient container and instead return this here in dice roller state, adding a semicolon at the end. And with that, we have this separate state object. Some things are missing here. We'll take care about them in a second. But now here in dice roller, in this create state function, we now call dice roller state with that leading underscore as a function. So we basically execute the constructor function of dice roller state. We haven't added a constructor function here, but as you learned, Dart automatically adds one by default in case you don't add one yourself. Speaking of constructor functions, we should add one here to our widget class to set that key parameter again. So to accept this named key parameter and forward it to the superclass, to stateful widget. That's the same as for stateless widget. And then we can also add const here. We can do this even though a stateful widget by definition is able to change internally because we have this class separation. And internally, Flutter in the end makes sure that the state object can change, which is why we don't add a const constructor to that, but the widget will be kept constant by Flutter. It will take care of that for us. So now we just need to make sure that this variable and this roll dice function are there, and therefore we can go back to gradient container, and in there take this variable and this function and cut it from there, which then also allows us to bring back const here because we removed that variable, which also allows us in main Dart to bring back const here and remove it in front of the colors. But more importantly, we can go to dice roller, to this dice roller state here, and there add both the variable and the roll dice function. And we can get rid of the print statement here now. With that, we have the variable here and this function. And therefore now we just have to make sure that we use the dice roller widget, which then is connected to that state, inside of gradient container. So there, I'll now use dice roller and instantiate this like this. And of course, to make sure that it is available here, we have to add an import, because you always have to import what you use in a file. So here I import from package basics, and then here dice roller.dart. If you save this and force a reload, you should now be able to click this button and change from a dice with 2 on it at the beginning to 4. Except for that it doesn't work. So what's missing? I mean, we are using a stateful widget after all. And indeed, you must use stateful widget, but that alone is not enough. Of course, here we have a variable which we change, but even that is not enough. Instead, by default, Flutter will simply ignore that. You change your variable, that's good, but that does not lead Flutter to re-execute this build method and re-evaluate the UI that it should output. And it must re-execute the build method to pick up any changes to active dice image. Because in here we have the code for displaying the image, and if active dice image changed, the image on the screen will only be updated if the build method executes again, so that all this code is re-evaluated. Because otherwise, if build never executes again, it's still this initial UI snapshot that will be output that was based on the previous value of active dice image. And that's a really important concept in programming in general, actually, that you should understand. If you're using a variable like active dice image here in your code, the code in which you use it, so in this case the build method in which we use it, does not magically re-execute just because you changed the variable value anywhere else in your code. This is not happening here, and this is not happening in other programming languages either. Instead, the value stored in this active dice image variable is only considered and used if the code where this variable is being used executes. So for example, when this build method executes for the first time. And the build method will execute for the first time when this widget, this dice roller widget, is rendered to the UI for the first time. And that in turn will be the case when the widget in which dice roller is used is being rendered, which ultimately all comes down to the run app function in the main.dart file, because that's where the entire UI widget tree starts being created. So that's when the build method here in dice roller executes in the end, and that's when Dart takes a look at active dice image and takes the currently stored path into account for, in this case, rendering an image on the screen. And initially, when this build method runs for the first time, because this widget is rendered for the first time, Dart therefore uses this dice2 image, which is the initial value for active dice image. So if you then change that variable value and you want Dart and Flutter to update the UI and take this latest variable value into account, you must find some way of getting Flutter to re-execute this build method of this widget, or of this widget's state in this case here. So how do we get Flutter to re-execute build? Well, we have to call a special function in the place where we update a value that is used inside of build and that will lead to some different UI output. We have to call the special setState function, which is available inside of state-based classes. So inside of dice roller state, since we extend Flutter's state class here, we have a setState function which we can call that is provided by this state class provided by Flutter. We have to call setState here inside of roll dice, and to setState you must pass a function. And here you typically pass an anonymous function, as I mentioned it earlier, related to the button. Inside of this anonymous function, you should now perform any updates to class variables, to object variables that should be reflected in the UI. Because setState, this function which is provided by Flutter, in the end tells Flutter that it should re-execute the build function of this state in which you call setState. And if after executing build, Flutter determines that you now expect a different UI than what you had before, it will go to the actual app UI and update it in all the places where updates are needed. So for example here, after setting active dice image to a different path when calling setState, Flutter will re-execute build, and indeed here, where we use active dice image, it will now see that a different kind of image should be displayed on the screen, hence it will go to the real UI that is active on the screen and update the image in there. And with that, with setState added, if you now save this and force a reload, you will finally be able to click roll dice and you see the image changed to a dice that shows us 4. And that's how you build stateful widgets and how you make sure that you can update the state and such state changes are then also reflected in the user interface.